Hello my fellow weirdlings, it's Margot, and today I'm bringing you some real-life sightings of Santa Claus. So whether you're someone who gets swept up in the Christmas spirit, someone who's trying to find it, someone who wants to believe, or a Grinch who could use a reason to snicker, keep watching. Is Santa the spirit of Christmas, a magical elf, the ghost of St. Nicholas, an eccentric billionaire with the sleigh-shaped experimental hovercraft, a weird little alien that flies around the world in his UFO pulled by extraterrestrial reindeer every Christmas Eve? Whoever or whatever he may be, these people claim to have seen him. Misty G says, when I was 9 years old, I couldn't get to sleep on Christmas Eve because I was excited about presents and I was wondering if my parents had anything to do with the gifts that I'd received from Santa the year before. We lived in Texas back then. That night it was hot because the heater was on. I got thirsty. I got out of bed and cracked open my door to make sure no one was out in the living room so I could get something to drink without being seen. I also wanted to spy. When I opened the door, I saw someone bent over, and then he stood up. It was Santa Claus, dressed in the red and white get-up. Strangely, I could see the Christmas lights from the tree shining through him. He was taking the stockings down off the mantel and placing them on the coffee table. When he started to turn around to put the next stocking on the table, I closed the door and jumped into bed. The next morning I woke up and told my sister what I'd seen. I told her where he'd put the stockings. When we went into the living room, the stockings were where I said he'd put them. We both turned and looked at each other and froze for a moment. From then on, I've told everyone that I believe in Santa. Drew says, I was about 7 and I was looking outside my second-story window, just waiting to see him. I saw something approaching in the distance. It was a huge sleigh and it was flying right over my house. I don't remember seeing any reindeer, but I did see a man dressed in red with a beard. I was so startled, but I kept looking, even sticking my head and half my body outside of the window. I told my family, but I knew they really didn't believe me. I swear on my life to this day I saw something. I don't know if it was really Santa Claus, but I did see what I described. Joanne says, I had an experience when I was 3 years old and still young enough to wear footed pajamas. The year was maybe 1969, Christmas Eve. I wanted to see what Santa had brought me, so I quietly walked down the hallway and looked around the corner to our living room. I saw my parents and someone I didn't know hanging around our Christmas tree. The stranger was an old guy with a white beard and hair with a red suit. I quickly went back to my room as fast as I could with footed pajamas and slid into bed. I told my mom what happened many years later, and she insisted that I was dreaming, or that it was my dad. That wasn't possible because my dad was sitting in a chair behind the stranger, and my mom was standing right next to my dad. I'm African American, and during that time the tenants in our building were all African American, so Santa stood out. Skitty Cat says, this happened near Seattle, Washington on Christmas Eve, 1957 or 58. My mom was at the kitchen window when she yelled for my sister and me, ages around 5 and 7, to come look. There was Santa and an elf carrying a big brown bag walking down the middle of the street. My dad went running out the door to see if Santa would come over and say Merry Christmas to us kids. But Santa, the elf, and the big brown bag had vanished. Carrie K says, it was Christmas Eve 1961. We were living in Boardman, Ohio. My bedroom was at the end of the house. I'd gone to sleep. I don't know what time it was, but I know it was very late when I suddenly woke up. I was staring at my bedroom door, which was catty-corner from my bed. As the door slowly opened, I pretended to close my eyes, because I didn't want my mother or father to catch me up in the middle of the night. There was a nightlight in the hallway, and one behind the dresser in my room, so there was some light. I was totally astonished, however, by who it was that opened the bedroom door. I found myself looking at a man dressed in a red suit. He had white trim around his waist like fur, a long white beard, and was wearing a Santa hat. He had red pants and black boots. If I close my eyes, I can still see Santa standing in my door. It made such an impression on me. He stood there and looked at me for a few seconds, then closed the door. I pulled the blankets over my head. I was so scared. Finally, I looked out, but no one was there. The next day, I asked my mother if she or my father had been out of bed the previous night. My mother said no. In fact, my sister was only 4 months old, and my mother told me she'd slept through the night for the first time since my sister was born. Neither of my parents had gotten up. Both of them were tired and they both slept. So I don't know who or what looked in my room that night. When I told my mother I'd seen Santa, she got really mad at me and told me that I had not. But I know what I saw. It was Santa Claus. I swear this story did happen, and I know I wasn't dreaming. Alex H. says, I'm 14 now, but this happened back in 2000, in my old house in Bristol, England. I was with my mom, my dad, and my sister. It was about midnight on Christmas Eve, and I was the only one awake because I was really excited. I could hear these big footsteps in my living room. I was quite scared, and I could also hear bells tinkling above me, so I wanted to see what was going on. I walked down the stairs very slowly, and I could see this big man putting presents around my living room. I wanted to say something, but I was too scared to do it because I thought he'd be angry. I ran back upstairs and went back to sleep. I was so convinced I saw the real Santa and told everyone in the morning, but no one believed me. Dell says, one Christmas Eve about 35 years ago while I was in my teens, I was in a car with my parents returning home very late at night. We were talking the whole way about Santa Claus and how great it would be if he really did exist. As we pulled into the driveway of our house, there he was tiptoeing in the snow in between two houses across the street. We all laughed when we saw this and remembered the incident for many Christmases thereafter. P.S. No robberies were reported. Richard says, I was probably around 8 years old when on Christmas Eve around 12 a.m. I'd been lying awake in bed for about 30 minutes. I was extremely excited thinking about the morning and opening presents. Anyway, I started to hear these very faint footsteps approaching. Slowly, a man in boots carrying a sack looked into my room, my parents' room, and then my brother's room. I'm absolutely 100% positive I was awake, too. I could see him fairly well because we had a nightlight on across the hall in our bathroom. I remember hiding my entire face under the covers, with a small portion of my eyes out to see. He then walked away quietly, and he was gone. Of course, I told my parents and brother in the morning about my sighting, and of course they thought I was crazy. To this day, I'm 28 now, I asked my parents if they had anything to do with this, and they still deny it and say I was dreaming. I strongly believe I saw a spirit or some kind of entity of Santa. Anna says, I was 5 years old and I was in my room when I heard shuffling in the living room. I got up and peered around the doorway, where I saw a man in a Santa suit standing in front of the Christmas tree. He must have felt my presence because he turned around and looked at me. He didn't look jolly or kind and happy like you'd expect Santa Claus to look. He looked kind of eerie, like he was staring into my soul. Automatically, I ran into my parents' room and hid under the covers. I don't know why I was so scared at the time, but I wrote it off as a dream for a while, before I forgot about it completely. Years later, I remembered it. I thought it could have been a burglar, but when I asked my parents, nothing was ever missing from that apartment. The only time we were ever robbed was when we moved later on. The only explanation I have now is that it was some kind of apparition. Jimmy says, an old friend came to see me a couple weeks ago. We lost touch years ago, but he managed to trace me and he brought me a Christmas card. After a few minutes, I asked him if he remembered the Christmas Eve about 30 years ago when we were outside our houses. We grew up next to each other. It must have been around 7:30 p.m. on a clear night when we suddenly heard a bell or bells in the distance getting closer real fast. As we both looked up, there was the reindeer, the sleigh, and Santa flying very fast and low over my house. It was brief, but we both ran to tell our families. Of course, everyone laughed, but I tell you, it was real. So when my friend turned up, I asked him if he remembered, and he said of course he did, but he didn't like telling people about it now. You can imagine why. An anonymous Santa sighter says, 3 Christmases ago I was coming home from my aunt's where we have a party. I was crying because one of my cousins told me that Santa wasn't real. Then we came around the corner of my street, and there it was, a big red sleigh and reindeer sitting on my roof, and then Santa popped out of my chimney. I told everyone the next morning to see if they could remember, but they couldn't. But a couple of days ago, my dad went up on the roof to fix the leak, and there were long, straight lines going across the roof. I took a picture and showed it to my baby cousins and told them to always believe. Jade says, I'm 13 now, but I saw something when I was 7. It was dark around midnight on Christmas Eve. I was in bed, but I wasn't asleep. Who could be? All of a sudden, I saw a red light beaming down into my window. It was so bright, and somehow I knew it was him. I looked up in the sky, but all I could see was the bright light coming from a small object. I didn't hear a helicopter or anything, but I did hear the unique sound of bells, and of course the sound of hooves tapping on the roof. These sounds lasted for a few seconds after the light had disappeared. Then they were gone. Claxton Kalmbach says, "It was Christmas Eve of 2002 in New York City. My parents had invited some friends and relatives over for dinner, sort of like a Christmas Eve celebration. After that, I decided to go to my room and watch some television, but there was nothing good to watch. I then found myself pacing back and forth in the hallway. My house is big, so there was no one with me. Everyone was in the living room, watching a movie I wasn't interested in. About 7 minutes into my pacing, I saw a tall, fat figure scurry away, about 20 feet away from me. It was crouched down, too. It was even wearing some sort of Santa Claus suit. I didn't believe in Santa, but this just freaked me out. There was a strange man in my house. I quickly ran to where my parents were and told them all about it. They grinned at me and said jokingly, maybe it was Santa Claus. I didn't believe that, so I just sat down in the living room with my family and everybody else. Then it occurred again on Christmas Eve 2004. I remember it more vividly than the last one. I was lying on the couch in the living room. My parents were in the kitchen having a conversation about a business blog or something. Suddenly I saw a huge man, about 7 or 8 feet tall, crawl underneath the tree and just vanish. Before it disappeared, it looked at me and said, "Shh." Very strange. So I went into the kitchen and sat with my parents. Similar happenings occurred the following Christmases. I recall one in 2007. It was daylight this time, and I just happened to see another figure with a Santa hat trudge by me for 2 seconds. Then it was gone. This really happened. Mrs. Wages says, I grew up in a suburb of Memphis, Tennessee. In the 1980s, I was 8 or 9 years old. My parents and I were coming home from a Christmas party on Christmas Eve. When we pulled up in the driveway, we saw Santa Claus in a sleigh hovering above our house. All we could hear were sleigh bells. The sleigh was illuminated so we could see Santa in full outfit in the sleigh. I remember seeing reindeer, but I don't know how many there were. Santa waved at us and flew off in the sleigh. I'll never forget it, and I'll never forget my dad's face of total shock. He was an air traffic controller, and when he went back to work after the holidays, he asked about it, and nothing came up. In another bizarre twist, on Black Friday of 2009, I was waiting in line at a local Target store and broke out into conversation with another lady in line. We were talking about Christmas shopping, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, she mentioned that her brother had seen Santa Claus in his sleigh 2 years before. I stood with my mouth wide open because I couldn't believe it. Every Christmas Eve, I still think about him and look outside to try to get a glimpse. This year, I haven't been able to do as much holiday-themed content as I'd wanted to. Thank you for being patient while I deal with annoying health issues and medication changes. I had so many videos planned and wasn't able to do them, but hopefully I'll be able to make up for it next year. I'll link last year's Holiday Horrors and Freaky Facts playlist in the description, in case you missed those videos on Christmas murders, superstitions, the origins of Krampus and other Christmas folklore, stupid holiday crimes, Christmas creepypasta, and weird history. I know many of you are struggling in your own ways, and the holidays aren't the easiest time for a lot of people. If you need someone to talk to and you live within the US, there are numbers on your screen and in the description box that you can call or text for support 24 hours a day. There's also a link for people outside of the US to find someone to talk to in your own country. And I'm always right here. That's all I have for you today. I hope you've enjoyed these stories and will come back for more. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and bring your friends, family, COVID pod, cult members, invisible friends, or enemies. And if you think you've seen Santa Claus, I'd love to hear all about it. Thanks so much for watching.